I was convinced early on that we were dealing with a serial killer. And if we really know the truth, I believe he's probably killed more people in Oregon than probably anybody else.
For a predator to be in a pen with all of the victims, who knows how many victims he's got?
He had opportunity. When that opportunity presented itself, he took advantage of it.
I don't know why. I mean, why? I guess he didn't need a reason.
What are the odds of being a prime suspect in all these murders? It wasn't until later, his first victim, that I even found out about this woman, and that she was still alive, and saying, oh man, she's lucky to be alive.
He's always been a demon in my life, lurking in the back of my head. And I found these words that express it very perfectly. It's called my darkness within. Some of my demons left me. Some are just asleep. A few always travel with me. Others haunt me from the deep. He was one of those. The little ones are charming. They're allowed to stay. The big ones tear me up inside. I just wish they'd go away. I'm sorry.
I know this road like the back of my hand. Same with the stations, only FM band. Farms and truck stops, fireworks stands. I know this road like the back of my hand.
Beginning in the late 1970s, a sinister presence cast a shadow over an isolated part of Central Oregon. It lurked in the background, ignored or unnoticed. Women, often vulnerable or marginalized, were disappearing. It wasn't until decades later that a reckoning finally came. My name is Noelle Crombie, and I'm a staff writer for The Oregonian. Over the past 2 years, I've investigated these crimes and the man who is suspected of committing them. I've read thousands of pages of police reports, traveled halfway across the country, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and spent countless hours driving the road along which the killings took place. This is a complicated story that jumps around in time, so throughout this video series, you'll hear from people who were present at the events they describe, as well as those who investigated them, in some instances, much later. You'll hear tapes of police interviews that were conducted years after some of the events they address. You'll learn information that has never before been made public. These are the stories of the ghosts of Highway 20.
Let me ask you another question then in this area. At any time ever, now think of this carefully, okay, have you gone ahead and been charged with any sex crime? Ever a suspect in any sexual crime?
Yes.
In 1977, Marlene Gabrielson was 20 years old. She lived in the small city of Lebanon along Highway 20 with her husband and their new baby. One night that June, the young couple dropped their daughter off with a friend so they could spend the night at the Sisters Rodeo.
I was underage, shouldn't have been drinking, and I got angry about something. Now I can't remember. So stupid that I just walked off and said, fine, I'm going to go home.
She asked around for a ride, and eventually a man with a pickup offered to take her home to Lebanon, about 80 miles away.
I thought there was nothing wrong. I'd be safe. It wasn't that far from home. I didn't even look around inside the vehicle. All I knew, it was just a beat-up old truck, and I was going home to my kid.
The man with the old truck was John Arthur Ackroyd. Ackroyd was in his late 20s and lived in Sweet Home. He'd recently returned to the area after getting out of the Army and was working for a local welding company, though within a year he'd be employed by the state as a highway mechanic. That night, he took Marlene west toward Lebanon on Highway 20, a road he knew well.
I noticed that there was no, covers on the doors. There was no handles and no roll-you-down thing. I sat in the passenger seat and didn't even think. Didn't even faze me that this was a trap.
Highway 20 twists and turns as it winds from Sisters to Lebanon, carving its way through mountainsides covered in dense evergreen forest. It's a sleepy stretch of road with little development and few landmarks, and it's dark at night. Exits lead to logging roads or campgrounds and quickly disappear into the brush.
I fell asleep, passed out. I woke up with my head banging on the seat.
The friend whose family needed food was Roger Dale Beck. Ackroyd's account of that morning shifted over time, but he said that on the day before Christmas, he got off work from an overnight shift at Santiam Junction at around 6:45 a.m. He said he then drove west on Highway 20 to help a disabled motorist, turned around and made his way to Camp Sherman to see if there were any deer in the area. There, he saw Kate Turner running for the first time. He then realized he was low on fuel and decided to head to a gas station about 10 miles away. He turned around and passed Kay for the second time. In some versions of his story, he claims he stopped and spoke to her briefly after almost hitting a dog with his truck.
Okay, so she was running, when you went in, she was running south?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
And when you came, and when you seen her the second time, she's running the same direction?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the dog ran out and you had to stop?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you talked to her?
I asked her if I heard it. I didn't feel the bump or anything. I said, when I told her, I said, well, Merry Christmas. She said, Merry Christmas to me, and I drove off.
Ackroyd says he then continued on to Sisters, filling up his tank before meeting up with Beck and heading out to poach a deer with his .22 caliber rifle.
John was an outdoorsman. He knew, he would talk to me about tracking things. He was a hunter. And hunters doesn't necessarily restrict it to animals.
Did you shoot something?
Yeah.
What was it, remember? Buck, doe?
No, I believe.
Doe. And you dressed it out there?
Yeah.
Fuel gun it? Went through in the truck?
Threw it back, picked up, went to Rogers.
Who shot it?
I did.
One shot, two shots?
One shot.
Where'd you hit it at?
Right between the eyes.
From the late 70s to the early 90s, Highway 20 between Bend and Newport was John Ackroyd's domain. He roamed the twisting blacktop from behind the wheel of state highway rigs and his own truck, usually alone, a phantom, caught, if at all, as a fleeting blur in the peripheral vision of passing motorists. Ackroyd can account for some of his time. He repaired equipment, helped stranded drivers, and cleared wrecks. He hunted, fished, and visited friends. But he spent long stretches of time alone, and what he was doing then remains the subject of much speculation.
I was convinced early on that we were dealing with a serial killer. And if we really know the truth, I believe he's probably killed more people in Oregon than probably anybody else.
I'm totally convinced John is responsible for a lot more. In my career, I've dealt with serial killers before, and I've talked to them, and I've interviewed them, and I feel John fits in that category.
You wonder, was Ackroyd a serial killer? Well, I mean, he was. by definition, a serial killer. He killed 2 people, separated by time and space. 12 years between Kay and Rashonda. What happened in between?
Who knows? There could have been, somebody before me, and we just don't know it. And how many do we don't know after that went missing? These are just the ones they know about.
In 2012, 2 investigators with the Lincoln County DA's office were working on a cold case from 20 years before. 2 young women, Melissa Sanders and Sheila Swanson, had disappeared in the spring of 1992 from a campground near Newport. Their bodies had been found several months later in the woods off Highway 20, near Eddyville. No arrests had ever been made. The investigators received a tip from a defense attorney in Bend. He suggested they take a look at someone whose name had come up at the time of the killings, but who had never been questioned. John Arthur Ackroyd.
Melissa lived in Sweet Home. Sheila lived in Lebanon. They were friends. They had planned to go camping with Melissa's family. So they drove over middle of the day, got to the beach in the afternoon, and had supper that night. Everybody went to sleep. And the next morning, the parents and grandparents woke up, and the girls were gone.
We didn't hear anything for like a week, wondering what happened and stuff like that. Why isn't she back? Melissa's mom and dad came over and said they didn't bring my sister back because they supposedly supposed to have been hitchhiking back. Talked to the Lebanon Police Department about it, and they pretty much blew it off like, yeah, that's just Sheila. She's just out running, doing what she wants to do type of deal.
The parents reported them missing after they'd been gone for about a week to 10 days. Not much came up until October of '92, when some hunters were hunting off Highway 20 and came across the bodies of 2 deceased people. And they were later identified as Melissa and Sheila.
Finding human remains along Highway 20 was nothing new over the years. In 1976, a skull belonging to an unidentified woman was found near Swamp Mountain. In 1978, the skull of another unidentified woman was found near Snow Creek. Also in 1978, the body of Elizabeth Musler, a young woman who had disappeared from Lebanon, was found in a shallow grave near Green Peter Reservoir. A year before that, personal effects belonging to 2 missing teenagers, Rodney Grissom and Karen Lee, had been found off a logging road near Highway 20, about a half-hour east of Sweet Home. Nothing beyond circumstance ever linked Ackroyd to any of these deaths, but circumstance is enough for Karen's mother, Violet, who is convinced he was her daughter's killer.
You do what you can. But it was a very important, maybe one of the most important things I've ever done in my life, is helping get him off the streets. You just don't know how many lives might have been saved.
It saved women's lives. If he'd stayed out, if he had never been convicted, he and maybe Beck would have done more crimes and killed more women, for sure. He managed to get through that whole thing without ever getting caught. That was the only time he's ever been arrested or charged with anything in his life. Not because he was all that smart, but he managed to do it.
How did Ackroyd manage to do it? He was an opportunistic killer who preyed on women who were vulnerable and exposed. A runner on an empty road, a child who feared him, 2 teens adrift in the world. There were no witnesses and no physical evidence, but there had been an unmistakable warning sign. Before he was ever suspected of being a killer, Ackroyd had raped Marlene Gabrielson in the woods outside of Sisters. She went to police, and they dismissed her as a liar. Ackroyd knew he'd gotten away with rape. He even laughed about it. He used the cover of Highway 20 to stalk women who were alone, and counted on society's blind eye to marginalized people to avoid prosecution for decades. Killing the right kind of people, in the right kind of place, during the right kind of time, was all it really took.